Bacevich, that was a terrific talk, and I'm going to race out and get that book.
I actually thought I was fumbling a little bit,
No,
so
no.
it makes me feel better
But
that
I
you
wanna
said
ask
that.
you-
I was fumbling. You were
I
great.
want to ask a question that is related to what you said, both as to whether or not this whole movement could have been stopped and what we should do about it at the present time. Was it a great mistake to end the draft? Was it when American families, to an enormous degree, don't have a stake in the game, doesn't it make it possible for something like this to happen, it seems to me? And that's, at the same time, giving enormous credit to those who have had to carry the battle.
Well, that's the subject of my previous book, and it's a good question. And interestingly, this question comes up every time I give a talk. Every time that I get two questions every time. One question is the Israel question, and the other question is the draft question. And my answer is this: the Vietnam War killed the citizen soldier tradition in this country, and we have forgotten that the citizen soldier had been, from the revolution down to Vietnam, the cornerstone of the American military system. Yes, we always had the regular army in which I served, but throughout American history, when there was a need to raise up a big army to deal with some particular situation, taking California, saving the Union, we had relied on citizen soldiers to get the job done. That tradition died in Vietnam. And the creation of the so-called all-volunteer force, which is a professional military, was Richard Nixon's way of acknowledging that the American people no longer wished to sustain the citizen soldier tradition. And it is unquestionably the case that very few people back then, in the 1970s, appreciated the implications of that decision. And one of those implications, which I think is now becoming increasingly clear to larger numbers of Americans, and that's why I get this question every time I give a talk, is that we have inadvertently allowed a gap to develop between the American military and American society, that we have thereby, we the people, have effectively surrendered any serious voice in how that military is going to be used. It has become the state's military, the president's military, and they do with it what they wish. And so there certainly is a need for a great public debate on this issue. I myself don't believe that it's politically feasible to restore the draft. There simply is a total absence of support. I think once the state forfeited its authority to command involuntary military service, it was probably impossible for the state to reclaim that authority. So the question is, what should we do? And I think that there are possibilities. One possibility is to create material incentives that will bring the middle class and members of the elite back into the military in greater numbers. What do I mean? Well, I mean, this is a state school, but it's still a pretty expensive school, I think. If we would promise every 18-year-old that if you serve 3 years in the United States military, you get a full ride to the University of Virginia, that would probably have some influence in at least some households who would want to avoid taking on that huge expense. So I think we could do that. The other thing, of course, and this is the grander, bolder idea, is a program of national service. Not simply conscripting a certain number of young people to serve in the military, but asserting that an obligation, as part of the path to full citizenship, is for every young person to spend a term of service to country or community. Around age 18, that you'd have to do something for 2 years, whether it was Teach for America, Peace Corps, United States Marine Corps, work in the local VA hospital, some expression of service, again, is something that, to my mind, deserves to be on the political agenda, ought to be on the agenda in the course of a presidential election year. Maybe it's a bad idea, and maybe there are defects in terms of its implementation, but it's the kind of thing that we should be talking about, in my judgment.
I'm
Circle back
wondering
around.
if you would be willing to talk about the role of the nuclear deal with Iran and how we should deal with Iran in the future.
The president nor members of his administration have said this out loud, but I believe that the purpose of the Iran deal was not, in particular, to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. That's nice to know that's going to happen. That the real purpose of the Iran nuclear deal was to end the isolation of Iran, to bring Iran, to offer Iran the opportunity to return to the international community. Why? Because as long as Iran is excluded from the international community, it will almost necessarily be a mischief maker. And as long as it's a mischief maker, then the chances of bringing about the kind of new equilibrium in the region that I referred to is close to zero. So the president has handed the Iranian leadership an opportunity to demonstrate that Iran can play a responsible role in the region. Whether or not Iran will use that opportunity wisely, I think very much remains to be seen. I believe that we won't have the answer to that question for perhaps another decade. Why would the president make this bet? I think the president makes this bet because he sees the future of Iranian politics being determined by the many millions of young Iranians who we know are pro-Western, who we know wish Iran to become part of the modern world. Or to flip that around, he's betting that the Ayatollahs, who are older than I am, are going to pass from the scene, and a new politics is going to shape Iranian behavior. Again, to emphasize, it's a bet. It's a bet that entails a considerable amount of risk, and it's a bet that I believe we won't know how it's going to turn out for many years to come. Now, we've got a couple of candidates, I think at least Senator Cruz, who of course declares that on day one of his presidency, he will tear up the Iran nuclear deal, which of course is not a bilateral arrangement between the United States and Iran. It actually involves the entire P5 plus Germany. But were someone like a President Cruz to do that, then I dare say that the proposition then gets canceled, and we're back where we were.
I'm very moved, and I'm also entirely in agreement with your assessment. But I'm also moved and in agreement with the dictum of General Colin Powell that if you break it, you own it. And if we're not going to do this through military occupation, is an humanitarian initiative an alternative? And what would that involve as far as military assistance is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you that I think it is imperative for us as citizens to take seriously the moral implications of our previous actions. That as citizens, it would be wrong of us simply to ignore that. B, I don't think that moral considerations matter squat when we got 6 people sitting around the Oval Office trying to figure out what to do about problem X. Now, the speechwriters, after they make their decision, will add a little moral frosting to whatever speech is going to be given to justify what the United States is going to do, but I don't really think that moral considerations shape U.S. policy. Maybe they should. I don't believe that they do. So you would say, well, we broke it. Doesn't that impose a moral obligation? I think it does. My problem with the line of argument is that that tends then to lead to the conclusion that I guess we need to perpetuate the war. I guess if we have a moral obligation, I guess that means we should send in the Marines as a way to acquit that obligation. And that I push back against. And I think that actually that there are ways to address our moral obligation that don't require the use of American military power. Quite specifically, if today the crisis of the moment, to which we have contributed, I don't think we're the principal cause, if today the crisis of the moment is the Syrian refugee crisis, then let us follow the example of Chancellor Merkel in Germany. Germany, think about that, folks. Germany, did you hear me? Germany has admitted 1 million Syrian refugees. If I am not mistaken, President Obama has promised that we will admit 10,000, and up to the present moment, I don't believe we've even admitted 3,000. So to the extent that the American people wish to acquit a moral obligation, the opportunity to do that, I think, is quite available and doesn't require us to send the Marines back to Iraq. Now, I have to say, the chances of the American people doing what I just said is nada. Which I again, I don't mean to be too cynical here, which I think tells us something about the extent to which our fellow citizens actually are willing to acknowledge the existence of some kind of a moral obligation.
One observation, one question. One observation would be that the drawing of artificial borders in the greater Middle East, as you term it, has been an exercise that's been going on at least since the Roman Empire, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, and so forth. We're certainly not the first who have attempted to do that. And left to their own devices, the people of the area don't seem to have much of an ability to do that themselves. That's an observation.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Okay. First of all, just to the purpose, my book does not argue that somehow or other the United States discovered the Middle East in 1980. Clearly, there were U.S. interests, there were U.S. policies, there were U.S. mistakes, but this is a military narrative. It's a military history, and my argument is that U.S. military involvement began in a significant way in 1980 after the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine. But the other point is, I'm not sure I fully agree that they can't be trusted to manage their own affairs for some considerable period of time. This is not my field, but for some considerable period of time, the Ottoman Empire, kind of a loose configuration, more or less, kinda, created an order in the region that was more or less, kinda, functional. It was the Europeans, as you know, who used World War I as the opportunity then to destroy the Ottoman Empire because they presumed that they could draw all these lines and create a new order that would suit them. So I'm not positive that they need.
That's a little closer to my expertise. I'm not sure I quite agree with you, but the one thing the Ottomans had going for them was the concept of caliphate. But the order that was maintained under Pax Ottomana was largely maintained militarily until they began to fail in the 19th century. I did have a question about the current, more current situation and about wars of choice and presidents and administrations that are variously involved with these adventures. You curiously left out Libya, which seems to be ultimately the quintessential war of choice. It had nothing really to do with American interest, and I believe we were basically drug in by the English and French and a bit by the Italians. But that's a war that's just left an incredible situation of chaos. And by not mentioning that war, it seems to absolve the current president of some of the sins that have been attached to his predecessors.
Well, it's a 400-page book, and we only had a 40-minute conversation. So there are quite a few things that I didn't mention, and I can assure you that it is in the book, and that I'm highly critical. Indeed, I'm highly critical of the Obama administration's perpetuation of this war. So by no means does he get left off the hook.
Let me ask you just we'll go to the young man there in a second, but just while you're on Obama, I don't think there's anyone who would say that the Obama foreign policy in this region has at least appeared from the outside, it has appeared messy at best. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. At the same time, President Obama has, in his own messy way, attempted to, partly in reaction to what happened in Libya, to say, okay, I'm not going to do that again in Syria. It actually has been willing to stop at certain moments when even his closest advisors are saying, no, we need to engage again. He mostly has been beaten up for that. There has not been a lot of credit. That has mostly been perceived as messiness as opposed to discipline and some willingness to take the political heat for that. Which way would you see that?
I think the title of my chapter on that is Entropy. And the argument I make is that, yes, President Obama learned that invading and occupying countries is a bad idea. So he has resisted the urging to do that, for example, with regard to the ISIS-Syria situation. But President Obama has by no means been averse to using force. He simply moved to a different set of methods and techniques. Greatly increased the use of UAVs as instruments of assassination, greatly increased the use of special operations forces for raids and punitive attacks. In the past few weeks, we've bombed Somalia, we've bombed Yemen. New York Times reports that there are Pentagon plans to resume a new bombing campaign in Libya. That hasn't happened yet. So there's plenty of military activism under the Obama administration. He's greatly expanded, by the way, the presence of U.S. forces in Africa, again, serving as proxies rather than a lot of direct combat operations. My principal critique of Obama is I can't tell what's the larger aim that all this activism is supposed to be serving. It is, for the most part, reactive activism. Seeing some particular problem and trying to step on it with some expectations that if you step on it frequently enough that you'll actually accomplish something. But there's very little evidence that stepping on them actually has any lasting positive political effects.
So definitely on the messiness side of the equation. So let's go to the fellow here and then we'll come to the back.
Hello, Professor. I took a class a couple years ago called War and Media, and in it, my professor, Professor Williams, we talked a lot about how the press failed in the lead up to the war and invasion of Iraq, and how some news agencies apologized afterwards. I would like to hear your take on that about the.
Well, I think it's a fair indictment. I think that in the wake of 9/11 and also in the wake of what appeared to be a successful campaign in Afghanistan, those appearances were a little bit deceptive, but that created a mood in the mainstream press that led them to be insufficiently critical, asking critical questions about the George W. Bush administration plan for invading Iraq. That said, once the insurgency in Iraq began, it seems to me that the quality of reporting overall was much better. That the cheerleading ended, and appropriately critical coverage of the war was provided, and I think that helps explain, for example, why when we get to the 2006 off-year elections that the Republicans were thrown out of power in both houses of Congress, and that then had some important political effects, like Rumsfeld being fired, which was a good thing.
I'll also, as a member of that class of society, I'll unkindly add to that an honest assessment of all that overwhelmingly places those actions in the hands of the New York Times. It was really the Times' staggering failure to acknowledge that it had essentially become a. I mean, the New York Times and the Washington Post, the front pages of those two papers are always essentially the organs of the White House. They're somewhat different organs, but whatever people have this misperception that that those organizations operate in conflict with the White House. But in reality, particularly the New York Times, is the official organ of the White House, whoever occupies it, and whatever the White House wants to put out on a particular day is almost certain to be on the front page of the New York Times the next day. That's just the way that works. And everyone else chases that. The Washington Post in a somewhat different way, and then the Wall Street Journal, where I worked, in a yet different way. But it really is the case that the Times' acceptance of this long stream of what turned out to be terribly mistaken information was the central failure in all of that. And that's unkind of me to put it so harshly on them, but it's also true.
I actually wanted to change the scene a little bit. I wanted to ask you about your 3 recommendations to the president, and in particular, your first one about the Asian century. I'm interested in what your thoughts are in terms of where the future is for America's military in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly as we see sort of military, particularly a naval build-up at the moment. And I asked this question about the sort of the future of America in that region in relation to your third point about American sort of acceptance of a failure in the Middle East. And I wonder if you see, and I wonder if perhaps there's a connection, or there might be a connection, between a sort of a redemptionist fear of a failure in the Middle East and perhaps a sort of continued belief in sort of redeeming that in Asia. And
so let me ask you a question first.
This is a loaded question, isn't it?
You're asking me what role the United States military should play in Asia. I think I understood that, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so I'm asking you, I'm going to answer your question.
Yep.
But you have to tell me, you have to define the aspirations of the Chinese government for China in this century. They want China to be what?
So how about we say that China wants to retain its stance on Taiwan? So it will be unwavering on Taiwan.
Okay, fine, good.
So if it says it's unwavering on Taiwan,
that's marginal significance.
It's also
in other words, here's the.
It's also good deep historical.
Is China a status quo power, or is China a power that wishes to become unquestionably preeminent in the Asia-Pacific region? Those are like, those like two quite different. Which is China going to be? And when you tell me, then I'll tell you what the U.S. military response would be. And my point of poking you is to say that we don't know what China wishes to be.
We don't know what China wishes to be, I agree, and which was my but we do know what American foreign policy, as you say, is based upon this idea of exceptionalism. And one of those notions...
And ought not to be, but yes.
And ought not to be. Mm-hmm. And one of those notions of exceptionalism is the idea that an American presence, wherever it is in the world, that it brings it's a positive force. Right?
And that's an idea that ought to be revisited. And indeed ought to be revisited in particular were we to reflect on what the American military presence produced in the greater Middle East.
But I suppose the second part of my question was going to be, so there's this idea of redemption, but there's also an idea of a continuous enemy. And so I wonder if the extent to which there is...
See, you and I actually are, we are completely in agreement, I think in the sense that the likelihood of the United States learning is relatively small. Yes. The likelihood of the United States rethinking its devotion to American exceptionalism is... I wrote a book a few years ago. It's called The Limits of Power, subtitle The End of American Exceptionalism. I mean, it was my publisher's subtitle. But the idea, I thought to myself...
You're never allowed to use that excuse, by the way.
Okay, but I thought to myself... Gosh, the catastrophe of the Iraq War, combined with the catastrophe of the Great Recession, the coincidence of those two things, clearly, this is the historical moment when Americans will be open to asking some first-order questions. Guess what? That was totally wrong. And so I don't believe that there is a heck of a lot of, I don't think there will be any willingness to acknowledge our military failure in the greater Middle East. I don't think that there's any willingness to rethink the claim of prerogatives implicit in the notion of American exceptionalism. I don't think, I say this with great regret, I don't think that Americans are even willing to consider the possibility of a multipolar order emerging in Asia in which we will have to view China and probably also India as co-equals. We will insist that, having won World War II, which is now over 70 years ago, right, that somehow we are thereby, we should thereby enjoy preeminence throughout the Pacific Basin. So I don't have any great hope that the kind of learning that I think is implicit in your very good questions is likely to happen.
But
Thanks so much for joining me.
And thank you. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.